Hello and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. If you missed it, Wizards of the Coast has announced that Fallen Empires Remastered is coming to MTG Arena. It's going to impact all formats, timeless, historic, standard. Yes, it's actually going to be released in standard, and it's going to have its own limited format for sealed and draft. So, if you missed part one where I talked about white, you should go back and take a look. I'm going to go ahead and dive into blue here. So we're starting off with Deep Spawn. This is by far the most expensive and largest creature of the entire format. We have a 6/6 Homerid with Trample for 8 mana, 3 blue and 5 colorless. So at the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice it unless you mill 2 cards, which there's not a lot of ways to utilize the graveyard in this format, but we'll talk about what there is in just a second. Can also pay a blue, and this gains Shroud until end of turn, and it doesn't untap during your next untap step, plus it gets tapped. So, it can protect itself as long as you got 1 blue mana open. But then it doesn't untap for your next turn and it taps down. It's got a pretty good built-in defense. A 6/6 Trampler definitely outsizes a lot of what's going on the battlefield in this format. The problem is this format's pretty aggressive. White and black are prioritizing these 3-drops that want to get in unblocked and, deal some nasty effect, like dealing damage to one of your creatures or destroying one of your creatures or making you discard 3 cards, stuff like that. And white and black can both splash a little bit of red for Goblin War Drums to give their creatures menace, or was it Goblin Kites? We'll look at it when we get to red later. It can give your creatures flying, as long as they have 2 toughness or less. Then you flip a coin at the end of turn to see if you sacrifice it. But some of those creatures, like in black, would sacrifice themselves anyway, so that doesn't even matter. In the face of a fast format like Fallen Empires, what's a creature like Deep Spawn to do? Well, I can see a few different ways you could try to make use of this card. So one is right beneath it. It's called High Tide. Now you would need to be mono blue, basically, to really do this play. But there's a chance you could pull it off in Fallen Empires because blue is one of the weakest colors, which means you're probably not fighting a lot of people for the blue cards. So you might be able to pull this off. You get to turn 5, you hit your 5th island, and then you tap 1, play High Tide. With your other 8 mana, you get a Deep Spawn. And as long as you've got another High Tide in your hand, you could play another Deep Spawn as soon as you draw it. Milling 2 cards a turn doesn't really matter if you're going to be trampling over for 6 and the opponent can't stop you. Another way you can use the Deep Spawn is in a blue-black deck. So black has a card called Soul Exchange. It's a 2-black sorcery. You exile a creature that you have on the battlefield. You bring back a creature from your graveyard. If the one you exiled happened to be a Thrall, it gets a +2/+2 counter. Which would be amazing in this case because Deep Spawn has Trample. So if you can set up a turn in a blue-black deck where you get Deep Spawn to your graveyard, and then you can Soul Exchange and bring the Deep Spawn back as a 6/6 or 8/8 Trampler, that could definitely close out the game quickly for you. I don't know that you can set that up by turn 2, for Soul Exchange, but the fact it only costs 2 black means you may be able to double spell the turn that you do that, which would be pretty backbreaking. So you could try a Reanimator angle with Deep Spawn. And a black deck might make you discard Deep Spawn by using him to Torok, and that could possibly play into what you wanted to do anyway. There is another option for something to do with Deep Spawn, and that is to find some way to get it on the battlefield, even if it's just paying 8 mana regularly in a multicolor deck. And then you sacrifice the Deep Spawn to a Homerid spawning bed down here, which would put out 8 1/1 blue Camerid creature tokens. And all of those are pretty good uses for the Deep Spawn. So it's a very slow card for a very fast format, but there are some ways to get this out, and there are some ways to make use of it once it's out. So yeah, I think there is a way to use this in Limited. I don't think it is beyond the pale. So I think for a normal deck in this format, it's close to unplayable. You could put a copy in as a big top end, in a random blue and whatever deck. And that would maybe be worthy of like a 1.5 rating. It is big. It can close out the game. But if you're in a deck where you can specifically High Tide ramp to it or reanimate it with Soul Exchange, then I think it's much better. It's like part of the key synergies of your deck at that point, and goes up to like, a 3 or a 3.5 for the deck that can use it. Plus, once you get the first Deep Spawn down, if you've got a Reanimator deck with a bunch of Soul Exchanges, then you get to keep milling new stuff into the graveyard. Find something else to Soul Exchange. Alright, High Tide. So this is a 1 blue instant. Until end of turn, whenever a player taps an island for mana, the player adds an additional blue. So this is a burst of extra mana card. It doesn't start to net you any extra mana until you have 3 islands. Now you tap one of them, then the other 2 islands make 4 mana now. So whereas you would have had 3 blue before, now you've got 4 blue. And the math improves as you go up from 3 islands. This card is a pretty good combo with the Deep Spawn. I would say, like the average Fallen Empires deck is probably not going to want a High Tide. If you're like 2 colors or more, then High Tide's going to be a pretty worthless card that you would never run. You kind of have to be in mono blue, and you kind of need a use for all of that mana. Now, even if you don't have a Deep Spawn, there are still some ways that you could, double spell, triple spell meaningfully off of a High Tide. Like, let's say you get to 5 islands in play, and you've got a pretty high mana curve in your deck. A lot of things you could be doing. Instead of using the 8 mana on the Deep Spawn, you could play like a Homerid and a Homerid Warrior, and that would add up to 8 mana. So if you're in mono blue and you've got a pretty high mana curve in your deck, where you got a lot of 3, 4, 5 plus drops, then I think you can make a High Tide deck in this format. For most decks, I think this is a 0, but for the deck that wants it, it's kind of an essential linchpin piece in a certain kind of mono blue deck. And that deck, this would be like a 3. Homerid. So this is a 2/2 for 3. It comes in with 1 Tide counter, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you add another Tide counter. So when it first comes in, it has exactly 1 Tide counter on it, and that means it is a 1/1. It has -1/-1. The next upkeep, it gets 2 Tide counters, it's just a 2/2. The next upkeep, you get to 3 Tide counters, it's a 3/3. And then you get to 4 Tide counters, you remove them all, it's a 2/2 again. So it starts at 1, goes to 2, then 3, then back to 2, then back to 1. This card is obviously not amazing, but it's actually pretty terrible in this format because it starts at 1 toughness. And that means you are potentially playing a 3 mana card in your deck that just dies to an Acacian Javelineers, removing its Javelin counter. Or if you're fighting against green, if green can get up to 3 counters on its Thorn Thallid, it can also just ping the Homerid dead when it's a 1/1. So, as long as the Homerid survives, that initial terrible line of play, then it's okay as a 2/2, it's great as a 3/3, but it's going to keep shifting back and forth, and it keeps giving the opponent an opportunity to be able to ping it dead, or to find a good attack when the Homerid is weak. Of course, you can find good attacks when the Homerid is strong. Since it comes down as a 1/1 and returns back to being a 1/1, I think this card's actually pretty bad in Fallen Empires format. Sometimes you just need bodies, so I think I would give this like a 1.5. But I think it's pretty bad with the pingers in the format. Next up, we have Homerid Shaman. And notice it has 1 toughness here. So it's a 2/1 for 4 mana. It has the activated ability of pay a blue, tap target green creature. And this card is pretty terrible. You'd think it'd be good against a green deck, except green decks have access to Thorn Thallid as a common, which means they get to, at some point in the game, just ping this thing dead. So I think one of the most interesting lines of play with the Homerid Shaman is, especially if you're doing sideboard play like best of 3, is you sideboard it in, you hold it in your hand, you don't deploy it, and you hold maybe a High Tide in your hand to get like a bunch of blue mana at the ready. And then all in one fell swoop, you cast your High Tide, you play the Homerid Shaman, you tap down the opponent's entire board, and you come across. And maybe that's enough of a tempo play that it doesn't matter if they can immediately ping the Homerid Shaman dead, you still got to tap down their entire board. So, as a sideboard card, I think this is at least worthy of a 0.5. But it just doesn't solve the matchups that you need it to solve. So it's pretty terrible, really. 1 toughness as a 4-drop. This is a pretty aggressive format, and maybe it would do a little work for you against a black deck where it's nice to have something that has 2 power that can maybe threaten to block your opponent's 2/2s that are trying to come in. But no, this card's pretty awful. I think I'm going to stick with a 0.5. Homerid Spawning Bed. So blue is a pretty weak color in this format, but Homerid Spawning Bed is a bright point. So this is an uncommon, it's 2 blue, enchantment. Activate ability, pay 2 blue and 1, sacrifice a blue creature. This is at instant speed. You create X 1/1 blue Camerid creature tokens, where X is the sacrifice creature's mana value. And there are some expensive blue creatures. There's the Deep Spawn, obviously. That could make 8 1/1s, which is pretty great. But even little stuff like taking a Homerid and exchanging it for 3 1/1s, or taking a Homerid Shaman and turning it into 4 1/1s, that is much better than the card you started with. I know it costs mana, right? You have to deploy that creature initially, and then you have to pay another 3, but still, Homerid Spawning Bed gives you a much better board presence than you would have had otherwise. So if you want to try to go wide, just don't activate this until the end of the opponent's turn, and then go as wide as you want. See if you can come in for the win. This is probably the best blue strategy in the format for trying to win the game in some way. There are still the problem of pingers that can, pick off your 1/1 camarids. And they'll be outsized, probably by a lot of what the opponent's creatures are, but this is a wonderful card in blue. Gives it a fighting chance in the format. And I would say, as far as blue goes, this is a bomb. I would call this like a 4. I don't think it's strong enough, to try to pull you into blue if you weren't starting there. The colored mana requirements are too steep and you have to activate it with blue creatures. So I don't think I can go above a 4. But yeah, this is definitely like the bomb card of blue. Homerid Warrior, this is not bad. This is one of blue's better plays to get on the board. It's a 3/3 for 5. It outsizes a good bit of the other creatures in the format. It can protect itself just like the deep spawn. You can pay a blue, it gains Shroud until end of turn, and it doesn't untap during your next untap step, and you tap it down. So you can protect it for the cost of tapping it down and not untapping. And being a 3/3 for 5, it actually sizes up pretty well against other stuff in the format. Plus, putting this in your deck gives you a pretty good option later to sacrifice to the spawning bed. So, taking all of that into consideration, Homerid Warrior is one of your better plays in all of blue. It's probably about a 3. Next up, we've got Mersane. This is a common blue aura, 2 blue, 2 colorless, enchants a creature. It comes in with 3 net counters. The enchanted creature does not untap during its controller's untap step if Mersane has a net counter on it. So most of the time you want to play this on something that's already tapped down. Once in a while, the opponent might have something really nasty like a Hand of Justice, and you might just start playing Mersanes on it to punish them for tapping it in the first place. To where the opponent feels like they have to pull the net counters off of it first before they can start trying to use it. And the way that they pull the net counters off is they have to pay the enchanted creature's mana cost. Colored mana symbols and everything to remove a net counter. So once they've pulled the 3 net counters off, the Mersane sticks around but doesn't do anything anymore. So this, it taxes the opponent. It's not a permanent answer to their creature, but it's really one of the few pieces of targeted removal in the whole format. Which, this wouldn't be a terrible reason to go 2 colors with a deck where if blue is just incredibly open, you're looking for ways to try to do a tempo fight against the opponent. Maybe Mersane would be a good enough reason to do so. There aren't that many expensive creatures in the format, which I think makes this not as good. If you're using this 4 mana card and you're putting it on a 2 mana card, the opponent can remove 2 net counters from it probably on their next turn. That's not a good deal. As long as the thing you're hitting with this is 3 mana or more, that is a pretty significant tax, and it's probably worth your time. And also, since it's just some of the only removal in the format, I would say this probably rates at least a 2.5. I would rate it more highly, except blue is already one of the weaker colors of the format. And it doesn't tap it down initially. Next up we have River Merfolk. This is a rare. It costs 2 blue, it is a 2/1, and you can pay a blue and this gains Mountain Walk until end of turn. So, how valuable is Mountain Walk in this format? It's a hard question to answer. Red is an amazing splash color, especially for white and black. Both of them want to, use the Goblin War Drums or the Goblin Kites to get their creatures to where they can't be blocked. So those decks are likely to have a red splash. But red, as we're going to see, is actually one of the other weakest colors in terms of taking it as one of your primary colors in your deck. The otherwise good orc creatures that are well statted for this format have an enormous problem named Orcish Captain, which doesn't just target your own creatures, it can target the opponent's creatures. And if you lose the coin flip, they get -2 toughness, which means anyone who has access to red mana and an Orcish Captain can machine gun the opposing red creatures dead. So being able to mountain walk is somewhat handy against like someone who's splashing into a red deck. I don't know how many true red decks you're actually going to fight against though in the format. And 1 toughness is a problem because of Icacian Javelineers and Thorn Thallid. This creature is pretty aggressively costed and could become unblockable. Normally that would make it pretty playable in a number of formats. Fallen Empires is a weird one though. I think this creature is actually not as good as it looks. So, River Merfolk, I'm afraid I can't go higher than about a 1.5 on this card. It looks so much better than that, but it costs 2 blue to get it down, which means a heavy commitment to blue. And then it has a lot of ways that it just dies in the format. So, this is between like a 1.5 and a 2, and I'm inclined to give it a 1.5. Sea Singer, this is an amazing piece of sideboard technology. Or, if you happen to be doing the Merfolk deck based around Vidalian War Machine down here, that might be another reason that you choose to run Sea Singer randomly in your deck, just because it's a Merfolk. So, it has the island home text. So when you control no islands, you sacrifice Sea Singer. I guess it doesn't include the part where it can't attack because it has 0 power. It says you may choose not to untap Sea Singer during your untap step. And that's because it has the ability to tap, gain control of target creature whose controller controls an island, for as long as you control the Sea Singer and the Sea Singer remains tapped. So, if your opponent has blue, if they're running islands, this card is just crushingly powerful and is worth the risk of being a 1 toughness creature in this format. And if you're in a best of 3 and you're sideboarding and you know that they don't have access to pingers and they do have blue, Sea Singer is just devastating in that case. Probably just wins the whole game by itself in that matchup. But if that's not the case, this card is nigh unplayable. Right? You could maybe just run it as a Merfolk with the Vidalian War Machine. But, so this card is wildly swingy. I think this ranges from being about a 1 in the Vidalian War Machine deck, or on the off chance your opponent might have an island. It's like really close to just being like sideboard unplayable, all the way up to being, in the right matchup with the sideboard, could be like the bomb that just destroys the opponent and wins the game. So cards like this are difficult to rate. If you're in that matchup where they can't ping it and they've got islands, then this card's like a 4.5. Otherwise, this is ranging down towards a 0.5 or a 1. Svelenite Priest. This is a Merfolk Cleric. It's a 1/1 for a blue and 1. You can pay 2 blue and tap. Target creature gains Shroud until end of turn. You can only do this during your upkeep. So normally you'd be targeting your own creature. And this means that if your opponent has an instant, they can respond. If they don't, then you've made your creature untargetable during your turn. Now you could, maybe in a weird corner case, make the opponent's creature gain Shroud during your turn, and that means that they couldn't target it with, Dwarven Armorer to give it a extra counter, or play some combat trick. That's a really niche application of this ability, though. I'm not saying it could never come up, but it's mana intensive, it's blue mana intensive, and it being a 1 toughness creature for 2, it just gets pinged dead, does not size up against the things it needs to size up against, and is pretty terrible all the way around. You can run this in a Merfolk deck with the Vidalian War Machine, but again, I think this card's, I'm going to give it like a 0.5. It's so bad in this format. Alright, Tidal Flats. We have a 1 blue enchantment. It has an activated ability of blue-blue. For each attacking creature without flying, which is almost all of them in this format, its controller may pay 1. And if they don't, creatures you control that are blocking that creature. Right, so this only works for when the opponent's attacking you. Right, you can't use this card offensively. It gives you an effect for creatures you control that are blocking. But yeah, if the opponent doesn't pay your tax, then creatures you control blocking that creature gain first strike until end of turn. This card's not very good. You can tax the opponent when they're attacking you to potentially give your blockers first strike, but the opponent doesn't have to pay as much mana as you do. Now, you can force the issue and force the tax on them. And maybe that means that they're not able to play other spells they wanted to play or activate other abilities that they wanted to activate. And the opponent, if you get this on the board, at least the opponent has to respect the fact that they can't tap out. If you get down to Tidal Flats, the opponent just can't tap out before combat, or all of your blockers are going to have first strike if you pay 2 blue. So, this card, it's not that it has no value. I think 1 copy of this card in a deck that can muster 2 blue is probably, the first copy's not bad. The first copy's probably playable. You're always, for the rest of the game, forcing the opponent to respect the fact that they can't tap out against you. And the more blue mana that you get access to, the more instances of this trigger they'd have to pay the tax for. So if you could wildly out-mana the opponent, such as, there's a trick here. If you have the Tidal Flats, the opponent's not thinking about this, they don't expect it, and you play High Tide. And that suddenly gives you an enormous amount of blue mana in a mono-blue deck. There is a chance that you could get a gotcha moment against the opponent. Where you High Tide and then activate the Tidal Flats. I don't know, 4 times, 5 times, they just can't pay the tax anymore. And now they get got, and all of your blockers have first strike, and maybe you blow them out. So, because this card is okay in a mono blue deck with the High Tide battle plan, I think I can give this card about a 2. The first copy is really not that bad. Now, the opponent has to play around it for the rest of the game. And if you get copies of High Tide, they might have trouble playing around it. They might not be able to play around it. But you don't want more than 1 copy. And this is why I can't rate it higher than a 2. Also, it doesn't do that much for you. It doesn't give you anything offensively. It's all defense. So, And I probably should rate this lower than a 2, but blue doesn't have much going on in Fallen Empires. So yeah, maybe it's only like a 1.5, but there's so little to latch onto in blue that I think this card's maybe a little better than it would otherwise normally be. Tidal Influence. This is an uncommon enchantment, blue and 2 colorless. You can only cast this spell if no permanents named Tidal Influence are on the battlefield. So if your opponent already has one, tough luck. That's the copy of Tidal Influence for the game. And if you already have a copy of Tidal Influence down, then you definitely don't want a second one, because you can't play it. So what's it do? It enters the battlefield with a tide counter on it. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a tide counter on it. So it's kind of like the Homerid. As long as there is exactly one tide counter on this, all blue creatures get -2 power. And that's the default mode of when it first comes in. So when you first play this Tidal Influence, it shrinks all blue creatures. And theoretically, you're the blue player. So the turn that you play the Tidal Influence, all of your creatures get smaller, and now all of your blocks are bad. Then it goes up to 2 tide counters, and they're all at their normal power. Then it goes up to 3 tide counters, and all blue creatures get +2 power, and this includes the opponent. Now, if the opponent's playing blue, there's a chance that playing this could trip them up more than it trips you up. So in some ways, this is almost better to splash. But again, the power pumping is also symmetrical. You get benefit from it before the opponent does. Right? You are the one who adds the 3rd tide counter, and you get first mover advantage in that case. But still, it's a symmetrical effect. And then when you hit 4 tide counters, goes back to normal, goes up to 1, goes to -2 power again. Because this format's pretty aggressive, and because white and black are actively trying to get creatures to attack in, to do things like, destroy one of your creatures, can't be regenerated, or sack their thing to make you discard 3. Or it doesn't deal combat damage, but it does hit one of your creatures for 3 damage. Or could be even worse with Feral's Mantle. White and black are actively trying to get in. And they may even be splashing red to try to get in with Menace or Flying. And Tidal Influence is asking you to suffer a turn of -2 power to all of your creatures in order to get this thing on the battlefield so that you can, one day in the future, take advantage of 3 tide counters. I think this card is pretty awful, but there is a saving grace. Tidal Influence is a team pump ability in the same color that gives us Homerid Spawning Bed. Right? Remember all these little 1/1 blue Camerid creature tokens? If you are doing the Homerid Spawning Bed deck, where you're taking your Homerid Warriors and your Deep Spawns and whatnot, and you're just sacrificing all your things to make 1/1s, that's the deck that might want Tidal Influence. And you could be sneaky and set up the Tidal Influence before the opponent even knows about the Homerid Spawning Bed, to where they don't see it coming until you deploy the Homerid Spawning Bed, maybe with a burst of mana from High Tides. And if the opponent doesn't see it coming, then you could play the Homerid Spawning Bed, and then at the end of their turn, play some High Tides, sack a bunch of stuff, gets to your turn, Tidal Influence goes up to 3 counters, attack with a bunch of 3/1s. That could be a way for blue to win the game. So I can't give this card a 0. Even as terrible as it is, it works very nicely with blue's go wide strategy. It's just that it requires a mountain of setup to do it. Since you don't want more than one copy in the deck, I think I'm going to give this a 2. I'm only giving it a 2 because it works so well with all of the 1/1 Camerids from the Hommered spawning bed. Otherwise, this would just be garbage that gets you killed in this format. But this can be the linchpin that wins you the game. So, I will give it a 2 for the first copy, and a 0 for any follow-up copies. Vidalian Knights, this is a rare. It is a 2/2 for 2 blue and 1. It has first strike, just all the time. It cannot attack unless the defending player controls an island. When you control no islands, you sacrifice this. So it has the island home text on it. And you can pay a blue and it gains flying until end of turn. And even though you very likely cannot attack with this card, you should choose this card very highly if you're in blue. Because this gives you a wall of first strike, and it actually gives you a flying blocker if the opponent's trying to sneak things across with goblin kites. So, Vidalian Knights, I would say just in terms of like setup, to give you a defensive board presence so you can go big and go longer in the game with your blue deck, which is probably what you want. I would run every copy of Vidalian Knights you get your hands on. Because even though it can't attack, later in the game, it can win in one of two ways. It can crew the Vidalian War Machine, which is not actually a vehicle, but it kind of is. Or you can sacrifice it to the Hommered spawning bed after it's been, a wall for you for, the majority of the game, and turn it into 3/1/1s to be part of your go wide win the game strategy. And until you get there, this just blocks for you. And it blocks very well. White might be able to force the issue of first strike against you, which is unfortunate, but at least it would trade. And if you have some way that you can pump the toughness of this, maybe with an armor thrall or something, then Vidalian Knights could just hold the battlefield for you and let your blue deck win the game where it's normally not the favorite. Now, unfortunately, this card's a rare, which means you can't guarantee you're going to get it, and you can't guarantee you're going to open a lot of copies of it. But if blue is starting to look pretty open, you can start taking Vidalian Knights, and again, I would take as many as you can find. Because later in the game, they're either going to power up the War Machine or get sacrificed and turned into 1/1s, and they will help you stall the board until such time as you can do that. For that reason, I think this card is a 3.5. In terms of what blue wants to do to try to win the game, I think this is top-notch. It can't quite win the game on its own, but it helps your strategy, whatever direction you're going. Alright, Vidalian Mage, this is a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard for 3. Has the activated ability, pay 1 blue and tap counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. So this is a counterspell tax that the opponent sees coming. So they can play around it. This might mean there are some plays they're not able to make if this is on the field, but they can play around it. And unfortunately, just like I was saying with the Hommerid, this is a 1/1 for 3. It does not block very well for you. Doesn't do a lot of what you need it to be doing. And probably just dies to an Acacian Javelineer or a Thorn Thallid. Now, it doesn't do nothing, right? You can force the opponent to play around the counterspell tax. It can crew the Vidalian War Machine. So it doesn't do nothing, but it's bad. A 1/1 for 3 is really bad in this format. So I'm going to give this card a 1. I would say this is filler that you really don't feel good about playing. Vidalian Soldiers. This is a 1/2 Merfolk Soldier for a blue and a colorless. It's a vanilla creature. That is its entire text box. So what I'm about to say may surprise you. But this creature is not embarrassingly statted for this format. Obviously, it would be far, far better if it was a 2/2 for 2. But having 2 toughness means that it doesn't just die to an Acacian Javelineer. It doesn't just die to a Thorn Thallid with 3 counters on it. The opponent needs to put forth more effort than that. So it's very likely that this is going to stick on the battlefield more so. And the first one you play is not that impressive, but getting 2 of them on the battlefield means you've got a very effective double block. Right? 2 Vidalian soldiers, get down 1 on turn 2, get another one down on turn 3. Now you've got 2 power and 4 toughness staring down the opponent, even if they, got their Goblin War Drums on time. They were gonna try to get in. Like turn 3, they played like Feral Zealots or Mind Stab Thrall or Neckrite. Turn 4, they had the Goblin War Drums, give it Menace. They thought they were going to get in and, do the thing, make you discard 3, kill one of your creatures for free. Not if you have a pair of 1/2s. In that case, if opponent goes, aw shucks. That's a pretty good wall. That's a pretty good line of defense against their creature. White still might be able to pressure you if they can, give their creature first strike. But black might get into a board stall with you at that point. Vidalian Soldiers is actually one of the better creatures in blue, and since it's a merfolk, it can power the Vidalian War Machine, and it's one of the most solid merfolk in the format. It doesn't just die to a pinger. So this card is probably a 3.0. This is probably a good, solid playable that always makes the cut. And that's really weird to say about a 1/2 for 2. But this format's so aggressive that you've got to get on the board. You've got to get on the board, and 1 toughness doesn't cut it. So this creature with the same stat line as Squire is actually really good in this format. It's really solid. It's what you want. And I would say it goes double if blue is just like a splash color for you, or like a, not a splash. I don't think there's any reason you'd splash blue. But if it's like your second color and you're not doing the high tide plan and all of that, then yeah, you're taking like all the Vidalian Soldiers you can get. It's probably, aside from like Homerid Warrior, and maybe going all the way up to Deep Spawn, this is one of the best creatures you can get in blue, and it does meet the other creatures in battle nicely. Stops the other 2/2s of the format. They work well blocking in multiples against whatever the opponent's doing. A 1/2 eats a Saproling token or a Camerid token, whatever little 1/1 the opponent might happen to have. Blocks very effectively against little 1/1 tokens like that. So, yeah, Vidalian Soldiers is actually really good in this format. I have to give it a 3 here. Finally, we end at the Vidalian War Machine. So, I've had this caveat about all the merfolk that they're at least slightly playable, a slight consideration because of this card. So what does it do? It is a 0/4 wall for 2 blue and 1 colorless. So, good blocker. Has defender, like walls usually do, can't attack. You may tap an untapped merfolk you control and it can attack as though it didn't have defender. Alright. You can also tap an untapped merfolk you control, it gets +2/+1 until end of turn. Aha. So, if you're all in on the merfolk plan, with your Vidalian Soldiers, the Vidalian War Machine is kind of like a Voltron. Like a gigantic creature that you can build in the format to, tap all of your merfolk in, and this thing can become enormous. Just can potentially outsize anything, whatever the opponent's doing across the battlefield from you. Other than maybe like a Thallid Devourer that sacrificed a bunch of saprolings. This thing can become gigantic. Now it does say when this dies, you destroy all merfolk that were tapped this turn to pay for its abilities, but since there's basically almost no removal in the format, and it's like at sorcery speed, other than like the Hand of Justice, if they got the Hand of Justice, you can't do this. But all the other removal in this format, you basically see it coming a mile away. So it's safe to go ahead and go in on this. The only question you have to be left with is, if I do this, if I tap all my merfolk down to come in with the War Machine, how bad is the crackback? You know, do I have enough blockers? Am I going to be able to defend myself when the opponent comes back at me? And that's a question you can only answer by looking at the board state at the time. It might be hard to accomplish that. Maybe if you've got a way to, you know, flood the board with Camarad tokens and stuff, then you'll have plenty of blockers, and you'll be able to force this attacking strategy through time and again. So it is a way to potentially win the game. There are some ways to disrupt this to where it's not a reliable strategy. This doesn't have trample. So, for instance, if you're against a green deck, they get out the 6/3 Thallid, the Feral Thallid, that it can remove 3 spore counters to regenerate itself. Or there can be other ways to regenerate their creatures, you know. They could have the Draconian Silex that can regenerate a creature. There are ways that the opponent could line up blockers for a long time against you, and you could be in trouble trying to get through with a creature that doesn't have trample to try to win the game. So even though this is one of Blue's win conditions, and it's one of the ways to win the game, it's not foolproof. It requires tapping down your board, it requires running a bunch of merfolk, and a bunch of the merfolk are weak. So I would give this card a 3 because I think you always run a 0/4 blocker for 3 in this format. And it's got the added upside of maybe being able to punch in and win the game at some point. But I don't think I can go higher than 3. I think 3 is kind of where it stops on this card. There's a lot of considerations here before you can really move all in on this. At least it's a good early blocker. And that is valuable in and of itself. And that takes us through all of Blue. Blue's got a lot of issues in Fallen Empires. It has sneaky ways to win the game. It has sneaky ways to make High Tide valuable if you're mono blue. And maybe that's part of the trick of this format, is finding the open lane in the draft. With blue being so weak as a color, if no one's fighting you for blue, you might be able to set up the ideal blue deck. The deck that wins with 1/1 Camarads and a High Tide that gets to 3 counters. Or the deck that wins by just powering out, you know, a couple of 6/6 trampling deep spawn. Could be. You know, you can turn things on their head once in a while, and you can make the bad color the good color if everyone's passing you what you need. Join me next time. We'll be talking about black, which I feel is the strongest color overall in Fallen Empires. So please like and subscribe. Check out my other videos. Helps out the channel a lot. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy on this day of April the 1st.